All right, so on with the webinar, I'm going to introduce Natalia Collier, who's with Environmental Protection of the Caribbean, our co-host on this webinar, and she will introduce today's speaker. Take it away, Natalia.
Hello. I first want to just mention that I am putting into the chat a sign-up sheet so we can get a record of everyone that is attending, hopefully, and where you're from. This will really help us in planning for the census so we can just get an idea of who has attended some of the webinars, is trained and ready to go. So we'll be putting that back up in the chat later on as well, but if you have a moment, please check that out. And I guess now it's my honor to welcome Dr. Christopher Haney and thank him for contributing his expertise in our mission to conduct a region-wide seabird census in 2023. This webinar that you're at is a crucial step in that process as we assist surveyors in building their skills to ensure high-quality data collection. Dr. Haney is the president of Terra Mar Applied Sciences, which he founded in 2013 in order to provide clients with ecological and economic research guided by principles of civic responsibility and environmental stewardship. Over the decades of his award-winning career, he has integrated a variety of disciplines, including marine science, climate change, wildlife biology, ecosystem management, and conservation policy. His work has taken him around the world, from the Soviet Union to Africa and throughout the insular Caribbean and Central America. This includes serving as one of the principal investigators for Birds Caribbean's 2011 to 2013 project, Building International Capacity for Seabird Conservation. Dr. Haney has been associated with many prestigious institutions, including Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, Defenders of Wildlife, Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council, the U.S. Department of State, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, where he led the largest pelagic study of marine birds ever conducted in the Gulf of Mexico following the Deepwater Horizon oil blowout. He has hundreds of publications, both peer-reviewed and public, as well as more than 150 invited presentations. We just added to his list. We are very fortunate to have Dr. Haney here to share his extensive experience and knowledge of the birds you will encounter when conducting a seabird census. And without further ado, I'd like to allow Dr. Haney to share his wealth of knowledge with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, both Lisa and Natalia. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and it's a pleasure to start talking again and relate to the West Indies and Caribbean region, a place where I spent a great deal of my time at an earlier stage in my career, and a place that I will always hold very near and dear to my heart. So we're going to talk about seabirds today, in particular, how to identify them and kind of how to pick them and separate them from each other. So I'm going to bring up the slide here. And first thing that we're going to do is essentially talk about how and why to separate some of the more thorny groups, basically how you can start to a plan of self-study on how to better identify seabirds. Can everyone see my slide now?
Not yet.
Well, let's see here. I think I'm showing, how's that? All right. Let's just go to the second slide. So the first thing we're going to do is mention 6 groups of seabirds that pose especially difficult or thorny identification problems. The first one is the dark tropical terns, the 2 species of noddy that breed in or near the Caribbean, brown and black noddy. A second group that's really hard to distinguish for many of us is the subtropical dark and white terns, bridled and sooty. Then there are the medium-sized white sternoterns, roseate and common tern. The 2 tropic birds found in the Caribbean, white-tailed and red-billed. Then the dark and white tube noses, Audubon shearwaters and the Pterodroma petrels. And then lastly, the 3 booby species that occur in the Caribbean. And I'll put a plug in this book, for this book again at the end. This is the links edition by Peter Harrison of Seabirds of the World. No affiliation, no commercial interest on my part. If you want one single reference guide for seabirds of the world and their identification, that's the one to have. I just used it earlier this year in the sub-Antarctic, where we had about 60 species of seabirds, and it was extremely important in helping us tease apart all the many albatrosses from each other, for example, or the diving petrels. We're going to start off with a very kind of generic seabird. And by the way, let me give you kind of an outline here. The birds that you see here are, first of all, going to be presented in AOU taxonomic order. So they'll pretty much follow the AOU checklist in terms of which comes next. That means we're going to start with a very common and easily known bird, the laughing gull. We're going to end with one, brown pelican. So those are kind of bookends for us. And I'm going to use something that is visually easy to follow, which is use the kind of old Peterson method of drawing attention to key field marks that help us differentiate one bird from another. So just follow those red arrows and they will point to some aspect of the bird's topography that help us identify it and separate it from everything else. Now, we're not going to go through every color phase, every molt phase, every age of seabirds. We will talk about it briefly in a couple of cases, but for the most part, this won't be a deep dive, a deep workshop, say, into differentiating all of the age classes of tropical boobies, for example. But we will give you some hints, and we will help you identify birds in breeding situations. Now, I've picked poses for the most part in which the birds are in flight, mainly because that just gives us more of a bird's eye view of the entire body. If you're working in a breeding or nesting colony, obviously you're going to see a lot of birds that are perched or roosted. Let's start with laughing gull. A laughing gull is a medium-sized, rather stout gull. We can tell it from other hooded gulls because it has a complete hood and a blood red bill during the breeding season. In the Caribbean, it's pretty much all we've got going, so it's easy. But if you are in wintertime or if you're in somewhere else, the things that help us distinguish laughing gull from other gulls are this very stout bill, which we can see here in winter. You can also see a trace of the hood in the wintertime plumage, but it still has that stout bill, and you can see a little bit of a droop to it. Also a key characteristic. And lastly, if you look at the head profile of laughing gull, you see it looks kind of flat. It's not rounded like a pigeon or even something like a Bonaparte's gull. It's rather flat, anvil shaped, and that also helps us distinguish this small to medium-sized gull from everything else. Aside from the hood, aside from that red bill and those white crescents in the breeding plumage around the eye, the mantle, that is to say the dorsal surface, the top side of the bird, is mostly gray with black primaries. You'll also see some white secondaries on the trailing edge. Now that's adult breeding and adult winter birds. If we look at birds that are roughly a year old, we see a much more brown tone, but it's this odd mixture of gray, brown, and white. You see a black band on the tail. You still see that heavy stout bill, a little bit of a trace of that hood on the head. But again, you also see that anvil flat-shaped head. And no matter what age class and no matter what breeding status laughing gulls are in, this helps us immensely pick it apart. And of course, it's named for its call, that raucous laughing sound that they're known for. All right, now let's jump into the terns. This is a tough one for me to identify, even though I've looked at lots of them and I practice with the books, because in the field, brown noddies just don't look like quite anything else. And at the same time, they look like several things at once. I'm going to help focus attention mainly on the head and the tail. This is a brown noddy. Brown noddies are rather stout, robust tropical terns. Their tail is either wedge shaped if it's folded or more rounded. And I'm sorry, I went a little bit too fast here. The thing to key in here is the head, the white head blends into the side of the face and the rest of the body in kind of an even tone. It's not a sharp white cap. It's gradual. It's whitest at the top and on the forehead, and then it blends very gradually into that brown plumage on the rest of the body. Other than that, there's not much contrast on it. It's a stout, rather gull-like tern. It's not terribly slim. And when you see it at a distance, it can be particularly tricky. And I'm going to show you a slide of what that looks like and kind of what to key in on. Brown noddies are very difficult to tell apart from black noddy. Now, black noddy is not particularly widespread in the Caribbean. It's found mainly in the Netherlands, Antilles, and in a few other places. It used to be historically found regularly in the Keys off Belize, but it's a very sporadic bird and nowhere particularly common, at least in our region. The difference between black noddy and brown noddy is the brown is much darker, bordering on black. The bird's a little daintier and smaller, which would be hard to tell if you saw it by itself, but that white cap really stands out as distinct from the rest of the body. Instead of a white top of the head that blends in, it's really a white skull cap that is differentiated quite markedly from the rest of the bird. It also has a thinner bill. We go back, you can see that the brown noddy's bill is kind of heavy, almost like a little bit like the laughing gull. When we go to the black noddy, you can see a slightly smaller and more delicate looking bill. But these are tough. It's easy if you see a black noddy in a colony of brown noddies, but if you see it by itself, it's a real trick. And many people have great difficulty, so don't feel alone there. Well, how might we distinguish brown noddies at a distance? Now, most of you are probably looking at this slide and going, I see dots over there. I have no idea what they are. This is a small seabird flock feeding over tuna in the area just north of the Florida Keys. And there are 3 species here. You might see the largest bird here, that's a brown booby. All of the rest of the birds are either brown noddies or sooty terns. If you look closely, you can see the white underneath in some of these birds, so those are easy. But how could we separate brown noddies? What should we look for? Well, the first thing to look for, let's see. This bird here is showing that wedge tail or fanned tail. It's not forked like bridled or sooty. So that tells us that's a brown noddy. What else could we see at a distance, even if we can't see clearly the coloration? The bird over here is all dark, dark underneath, dark on top. That's really the only tropical tern that does that. And in fact, it's one of the only seabirds in the Caribbean that is so dark, both above and below. And lastly, over here on the far left, we can see a bird kind of coming at us, and we can see that white cap. And that's the kind of clue that you might need if you see these birds at a distance. If you have them in a colony, of course, it'll be much easier. That's one pair or one group of birds it's tough to tell apart. The next one are the tropical Onocurayan terns, both sooty and bridle. Again, if these are seen together, if you're fortunate enough, it's a little bit easier. But if they're separate, especially at a distance, it's quite difficult. Before we get into the pattern, I want to talk a little bit about habits. Sooty terns, at least at sea, typically occur in flocks, and they often spend a great deal of time flying higher above the ocean surface, sometimes several hundred meters above the ocean surface. Bridle terns fly usually, not always, but usually much closer to the ocean surface, within 2 or 3 meters. And they especially like to hang around places with sargassum. This is especially true away from the breeding colonies. I don't know if they have the same habits near their breeding grounds in the Bahamas and elsewhere in the Caribbean. How do we tell them apart? Well, we're going to dive into that a little bit better here, but the main thing is that sooty tern really shows blackish dorsal surface. It looks black on top, whereas bridal tern looks gray, and sometimes almost with a hint of brown in that gray. Bridal tern has a white hind neck or collar. The sooty tern does not. And there's a lot more white on the outer tail feathers of the bridal tern than there is on the sooty. They also differ a little bit in their proportions or bulk. I wouldn't use that. I would use these other field marks that I'm going to show you now. If you can see it, the best way to distinguish them is how far the white goes to or over the eye. If the white only gets to the eye or stops in front of it, it's a sooty tern. If, however, the white goes to, over, and slightly behind the eye, it's a bridal tern. And that is a dead giveaway. So again, that might be hard to see of a moving bird, but if you're in a colony walking around, this should help you immensely. Again, here we see a bridal tern in flight. We can see how long that white extends to and above the eye. It also shows a very prominent white neck collar. And the wings and back are gray, not sooty black. In contrast, an adult breeding, let's go to the juvenile first. Young bridal terns show a lot of brown in them. And the brown is confined to the top of the bird, not to the bottom, which is different than sooty, which we'll see here in a minute. Again, it's this grayish brown blend. It has that white collar and maybe the suggestion of the cap with a whitish forehead. That would be your young bridal tern. Sooty tern shows this really uniformly dark pattern, a much shorter white extension to the eye on top of the bill, not above it or behind it, but just barely to the eye, and it shows no neck collar. Young sooty terns are confusing in a couple of ways. When they show up with adults, one goes, what is that? Is that a brown noddy? What am I seeing here? Young sooty terns, that is to say, birds that are less than a year old, young of the year essentially, show almost all dark coloration. They're usually a bit smaller than the adults. The tail usually isn't as long, but they show a lot of dark brown or bordering on black, both above and below. The giveaway, though, is the white wing lining, and that distinguishes young sooty terns from brown noddy. So if we see some tropical terns feeding and we can't tell what they are, if they're all brown, all dark, brown noddy, if they have white underwings, it probably includes some individuals or some young sooty terns. And by the way, young sooty terns typically in this plumage follow and stay with the adults or very near the adults. I don't know that I've ever seen young sooty terns by themselves alone away from the colony. So generally speaking, if you see the young birds, you're going to see the adults nearby, which may help you identify them. But in this particular depiction, you can see that if we look from above, it looks all dark. And again, at a distance, that might be hard to tell it's a young sooty tern. It might tell us that it looks a little bit like a brown noddy. In such cases, we could look at the tail and see if it's forked or wedge-shaped. Wedge-shaped brown noddy, forked sooty tern. Now we're going to get into an easy one. This is the very charismatic, I think, least tern. Now, least terns are tiny. They're more or less the size of a Calidra sandpiper and maybe even less in terms of bulk. If you see them at a distance, that small size is almost impossible to miss. And they have very fast, heavy wing beats that are deep and go way up and way down. They look like they're really working at it, unlike some of the other terns that might intersperse their flights with a little bit of gliding. At close distances, the yellow bill with a black tip is a dead giveaway. They also have a black skull cap with a white forehead that extends to the eye. Their tail is not particularly long. It is forked, so I would call it somewhere in the medium in terms of length relative to the rest of the body. But the real giveaway on this bird is just size and energy, lots of really heavy, fast wing motion. This next tern is an odd one in many respects. Gull-billed terns have some rather odd habits, but we're not going to focus on that. We're really looking at their structure and morphology. The best thing to key in on with gull-billed tern is, you guessed it, the bill. The bill is stout and thick, and it is somewhat about the bulk, perhaps, maybe a little smaller than a laughing gull's. It doesn't droop like a laughing gull, but it is not slim and elegant or sharply pointed like most terns. It's very thick. And this bird often in the field appears ghostly white. Other than the black skull cap and the bill, the rest of the bird doesn't have a lot of stark contrast on it. There's a little bit of dark trailing edge to the outer primaries that might or might not be visible at a distance. In overall shape, this bird is going to appear stocky, maybe even heavy set. And you might be scratching your head, is this some kind of weird gull? What? It doesn't look like any of the other terns. And again, focus on its proportions, its heavy set nature, and this thick bill. In the wintertime, it loses the skull cap. It still has the heavy bill though, and instead of that skull cap, it has a blackish eye stripe. It has those pale gray edges to the outermost primaries, but it's still that stocky shape. And if you were to screen out everything but the head, you know, maybe forget the tail and the wings, you could see that just the head by itself looks very much like a gull. Briefly, I will say gull-billed terns are not likely to be seen very far from land. So if you're out at sea, you can almost screen this out, particularly if you're out of sight of land. It's very uncommon to see them very far from shore. That's not the case with the other terns that we've covered so far. Okay. Now we're into our third group of tough ones, comparing, differentiating roseate tern from the other breeder in the Caribbean, the common tern. Now, again, we're going to look at some things that aren't just the pattern of the bird, but more of its overall shape and its silhouette. Roseate terns are supremely elegant and streamlined. They're very, if roseate tern is an F-16 fighter jet, common tern is an F-4 from the World War II era, a little bit stockier and a little heavier set. We're going to see that in a minute. The key to roseate tern is its very long tail, especially in the breeding season. The tail is longer in proportion than any of the other similar sterna terns in or outside the Caribbean. But comparison to common tern, it's much longer. It also has faster and stiffer wing beats. Some people describe it as a pulsing flight, meaning it kind of goes and stops and goes, and it's not continuous. And if you see enough of them and learn that, that would help. Its bill is typically thin, much thinner in proportion than a common tern, with a reddish orange base and a black tip. This is a adult roseate tern on the top and a young roseate tern in the middle, both of which now outside that strict breeding plumage. But notice that even outside the breeding season, how long the tail is on this roseate tern and how delicate, needle-like, and thin their bill is. The bird on the lower left, I think, is a common tern. I'm not sure because I didn't look at the caption where I took the photo, but we'll see common terns here in a minute. But the thing is, this bird, roseate terns, are very, very pale. There's something else I want to draw your attention to, which is easy to tell the two terns apart when they're in flight. You can go back and you see that there's a dark leading edge to the wing. Those primaries, those first 3 or 4 primaries on the outer wing, on the leading edge only, okay? Keep that in mind, because we can see that also here in the wintering or non-breeding roseate tern, that black primaries on the first 3 or 4 feathers on the leading edge of the wing, not the trailing. In contrast, common terns have black on the leading and trailing edge. That's what's depicted here, such that when you put them together, it forms kind of a white wedge between 2 black borders. That field mark is exceedingly reliable for common tern. And so if you look carefully at a tern and you see that black V, leading edge and trailing edge, and actually the trailing edge is a little darker, that tells you it's a common tern. So even if you don't get a good look at the tail, you don't get a good look at the bill, if you see that on the outer wing, you know it's a common tern. And that's what I would focus on. Common terns are sort of the archetypical sterna tern, medium-sized white tern. They hover and plunge dive readily, more or less from a vertical position. In breeding plumage, common terns have a gray underbody and a white cheek, which confuses some people with Arctic tern. We don't have to worry about that in the Caribbean. But it is an easy thing to tell them apart from roseate terns in the summertime or when they're breeding. If we look at a common tern that's non-breeding, we still see that very characteristic black V on the outer wing, especially the underwing, with the white wedge in between. That more extensive dark outer primaries is a good giveaway to separate common tern from roseate tern. And you'll also notice the bill is stouter. It just doesn't have that long, skinny profile that we see here in the roseate tern. Now, if they're side by side, it's much easier. So I've got a depiction here showing you that. But I want to draw your attention to, again, that key field mark about the wing, the outer wing. On the common tern, we see the black V and the white wedge in between. On the roseate tern, we only see black on the leading edge of the wing, whereas the trailing edge is white. Again, focus on that. That should help you differentiate them almost anywhere, anytime. Royal tern. This is the big guy, big heavy-set tern with a shaggy crest and a rather stout orange or reddish orange. Well, actually, the shade of the bill can vary from yellow orange to slightly reddish orange, but it's always, its base color is orange as opposed to red, which is more indicative of Caspian tern, which we'll compare it to here in a minute. The size of this bird is so distinctive, and it's the only breeding tern of this size, that there's not a whole lot else we need to focus on. The shaggy crest, in the summertime, it's a continuous black. In the wintertime, it's got a white forehead, and that heavy orange bill should enable you to identify royal tern just about anytime, anywhere. Now we're going to talk about a medium-sized tern. Actually, I find sandwich terns sometimes when they're by themselves the hardest to identify, because without, especially at sea, if you can't see their size, you're not sure what you're looking at. Am I looking at some kind of a smaller mid-sized sterna tern like common, or what do I have here? If we look close enough though, the fairly long black bill with the yellow tip should tell us always that it is a sandwich tern. Now I've put in parentheses Cabot's tern here because depending upon the authority that we use, sandwich tern and Cabot's terns are differentiated. Sandwich tern is the term that some authorities use for the bird in the old world, Europe and Africa, where they reserve the term Cabot's tern for the one in this hemisphere. Cabot's tern is a slightly smaller version of sandwich tern. So if you run into that in a book, don't be too confused. And maybe someday the AOU will settle this for us, but for now, the field identification for both of these is essentially identical. In the breeding season, sandwich Cabot's terns have shaggy black crest, black with a long black bill and the yellow tip. In the wintertime, they lose the black forehead and gain a white forehead, but they still have that black bill with the yellow tip. In the southern part of the Caribbean, in the Nederlandse Antillen, the Netherlands Antilles, there's another form, the Urignathus race of Cabot's or sandwich tern, called Cayenne tern, and it has an all yellow bill. It essentially, though, its structure, its proportions, its heft are the same. And it still has that black shaggy crest in the breeding season with a extensive white forehead in the winter when it's not breeding. And that is the field characteristics for Cayenne tern, which some of you in the southern region may have encountered. Now, if we put two Caribbean terns next to Caspian tern, which is a migrant in the West Indies, we can see quite a substantial size difference. The Caspian tern is really big, and its bill color borders on blood red, if it may be reddish orange, but it's never more on the yellow end of the color spectrum, as is the royal tern. So the royal terns is yellow or yellow orange. And you see a sandwich or Cabot's tern there on the left with that shaggy black crest. So they're quite different in size, which might not be apparent unless they're conveniently sitting next to each other like they are here. All right, we're going to go on now to the fourth group of tough to separate seabirds in the Caribbean. These are the tropic birds. And this is a white-tailed tropic bird here depicted in a number of poses. What you really want to focus in here is, at least in the adults, this prominent black V that goes over the back of the secondaries and onto the back of the bird itself. This is a red-billed tropic bird, a much more heavy-set, stockier tropic bird with a much heavier bill, which is hard to tell unless you have the birds together. But these birds can be remarkably difficult to tell apart at sea. If you're at a breeding colony, it's a piece of cake. You just look, you can handle the bird and hone in on a couple of places where it will tell you what it is, who it is. And the places to hone in on are the back of the head and the back of the top side of the wings. The top side of the wings, the outer primaries, and whether or not the bird has a black nape bar or nuchal bar is the thing to cue in on for these birds, no matter what their age. So if we put them in comparison here, red-billed at the top, white-tailed at the bottom, we see that on the top side of the wing, a white-tailed shows much more black overall, with these carpal bars that form this kind of V over the back. However, the black on the primaries is rather less than on a red-billed. The red-billed black extends beyond the base of the primaries and into the primary coverts. So it's a little bit longer. And an adult red-billed lacks that black carpal bar that you see on the white-tailed. What a red-billed has that a white-tailed does not is a nuchal collar, something that goes a black stripe through the eye and goes up over the head and joins the black through the eye on the other side. That nuchal collar, which again is hard to see if the bird's above you, is a dead giveaway for red-billed. White-taileds never have it. And red-bills have it, or a trace of it, no matter what their age. From now we're going to look at two immature tropic birds, and you can see how much they look alike. If you saw one by itself, it might be almost impossible to tell it apart, and that's okay. We let a lot of them go at sea at sea. We just let them go as unidentified tropic birds. But you can see on the left here a heavier set bill in the red-billed, the black that goes beyond the primaries and into the primary coverts. And the lack, well, you really can't see that from this angle. You can't see that there's a nuchal collar, but if we could see this bird from the top, it would have it. So an adult red-billed tropic bird has this heavy, deep red bill. Bill color is not reliable, however. Don't focus on bill color at all, unless the bird is an adult. And even then, be careful, because when they're in peak breeding form, the hue on a white-tailed tropic bird's bill can edge away from yellow into the orange direction. And so just be very careful. The red bills is heavier. It does lean more towards the red end of the spectrum, but notice that black nuchal collar that goes around the back of the head, and more black on the top side of the wings. A young bird has that hint of a nuchal collar as well, and it also has that black extending further into the wing than a white-tailed. White-tails in this pose are easy to tell apart because they have that black carpal bar. You'll notice that the black goes through the eye and behind it, but then stops. It doesn't wrap around. And then in a young white-tailed tropic bird, the same thing. It might have a hint of the carpal bar, but there is no hint of a nuchal collar that goes from one eye around the back of the head to the other. You'll notice also white primary coverts, much less black in the ends of the primaries. All right, our fifth difficult group is the small or medium-sized dark and white Procellaria forms. So we're going to look at black-capped petrel and Audubon shearwater, briefly touch on Bermuda petrel. Black-capped petrel is a heavy-set, stocky bird with magnificent flight characteristics, roller coasts across the ocean in moderate winds. It has a black skull cap and a prominent white nape. The bill is short and thick and very robust. It's not delicate. It's also not something that you want anywhere near your fingers. I'm speaking from experience. It also has, in most cases, a prominent U or V-shaped white rump. The top side is either a grayish brown, brownish gray, depending on the molt, but it's generally at a distance. It shows a very prominent dark and white pattern, dark above, white below. On the bottom side, there's a lot of white under the wing. And in fact, it's entirely white, except for the wings, from the chin basically all the way back to the undertail coverts. There's also a prominent black bar, an axillary bar on the wing. You can still see the black skull cap, usually no matter how the bird is angled towards you, and of course, this short, thick, heavy bill. There are two so-called color phases for black-capped petrels, the white-faced or light morph and the dark-faced or the dark morph. And these actually are more, there are intermediate birds as well, so that's not always easy to tell. But I'm going to mention them because it's important to learn this characteristic if you ever have any hope or desire to try to separate Bermuda petrel at sea. A light phase or light morph black-capped petrel has white behind the eye, a lot of white on the face. It has just the barest minimum of a black skull cap. In contrast, a dark phased or dark morph black-capped petrel has black behind the eye, and the white nape bar might be reduced in width or even reduced in intensity to just be a barely perceptible gray color. But there's much, much more dark on the face overall than in the light version. Now, why is that important? Well, the Bermuda petrel is somewhat extraliminal to most of the Caribbean. I don't know that there are any records from the West Indies proper, but it's so rare, and any observations would be so valuable. It does wander widely, that I'm going to put this one slide in there just for our reference. In comparison to black-capped petrels, its bill is much more delicate, it's shorter and thinner. It also has much more black on the leading edge of the wing. And if we get a good look at the side of the face, it's all dark, always all dark. It never has a white hind neck, ever, ever, ever. And it has this dark neck tab that kind of extends down into the breast and upper or lower neck region, which is something that blackcaps don't have. So if you see any of those characteristics, and it's a much more delicate looking bird, but smaller than black-capped, then you might be onto a Bermuda petrel. The other common or widespread tube nose in the Caribbean is the Audubon shearwater. This is my favorite field mark for Audubons. In comparison to all dark and white shearwaters, no matter their size, this little guy looks long-bodied and short-winged. Its wings look short in proportion to its body, so it's always working really hard, especially in calm winds. If you get a good look and see the dark under tail coverts, great, good on you. You're better than me. I can't, or rarely do. If I take a look at the face, though, I can often see white, either in front of the eye or around the eye, and more white around the face helps me separate it from some other rarer shearwaters in this region. Again, if you see a small dark and white shearwater fluttering like this over the ocean, it's most likely going to be an Audubon's. But if you want to learn the field marks to hone in on, to tease it apart from everything else, let's consider the following. The undertail coverts are going to be dark always. The face is going to show a fair bit of white. It's not going to look dark and dark below the eye. There's going to be dark maybe at the eye and above, or I'm sorry, white at the eye and above. That won't show up on things like Manx shearwater. And there won't be any kind of prominent neck bar or cowl, partial collar on this bird. And again, the long-bodied, short-winged with very fast, almost labored wing beats helps us tell this apart. This is just another view. You can see a little bit of white there around the face, no large distinct patches on the neck, and those dark undertail coverts right underneath the tail. This is an easy one and a crowd favorite, magnificent frigate bird. I've depicted here an adult breeding male, a female, and an immature. Really, there's nothing else in the Caribbean as big as frigate birds, dark with this long forked tail to confuse with. So it's not so much that the species needs help in identification, it's the age. And even that's pretty easy. The red gular pouch on a male frigate bird might not be visible, or it might be very indistinct or pale, but if it's all black, it's male. Females have a black head, but extensive white on the breast and upper belly. Whereas the immature birds, birds of around a year or so, have a white head, a white breast, and white extending into the belly. So the immatures have the most white. And I'll just say one other thing. If you're doing surveys away from the breeding colony and you want to be sure to detect frigate birds, if you're doing some surveys between islands or at sea, for example, always look up. They spend a great deal of time at height, and it's very easy to miss them if one is focused kind of at eye level or even slightly above. They're very high, and they can reach heights of hundreds and hundreds of meters and would be very hard to find accordingly. I'm going to talk now about the tropical sulids, the boobies, and in brief review, laughing gulls are 2-year gulls, meaning that it takes them around 2+ years to go from immature plumage to adult. The sulids as a group take anywhere from 3 to as many as 5 years to reach adulthood. And what that means is as they get there, they go through a plumage sequence that changes. So we actually have to learn their characteristics at all of these ages, and that's tough. That's hard. If we want to do that someday, if it's important for you to do a demographic study on a colony of boobies and you need to identify them by ages, maybe we can do a workshop and I'll put together some slides that show the various age classes. We're going to rush through that and only for one bird here, only one species, the masked booby. Masked boobies are very stout and heavy set. They have a massive bill, which is usually a kind of greenish yellow in color. The dark mask around the bill is what gave them the name. And they also have this very characteristic black primaries and secondaries that go all the way along the trailing edge of the wing. They have a black tail and these black wings along the tip and then the trailing edge. The rest of the body is pure white as an adult. If we go back through the age classes, however, we see this indistinct hood. We can see that there's a lot of dark on the wing, but seeing this bird like this, you might go, what is it? Is it a gannet, a masked booby? Is it even the white phase of a red-footed booby? Again, that very heavy set, stocky appearance, big, robust bill, yellow, and this hooded appearance tell us that it can only be a masked booby. Anytime you see that hood, you're seeing a masked booby of a younger age class. Here's another angle on a bird of about the same age. Here you can see a little bit of a high neck or white collar behind that hood. Again, that's a good giveaway that this is a masked booby. You'll notice though that the bill color on this younger bird is not yellowish. It's more of a slaty or gray color. So the bill color is reliable as an adult. It might not help you much when the bird's young. But this extensive dark above, white below, and this hood and white high neck tells us it's a masked booby. This is a bird that's even younger still. This bird's probably only a few months old. And it has almost an all dark head. Their white high neck is barely visible at all. And almost the entire dorsal surface is this dark, sort of grayish brown color. Again, that would be the youngest. So we started here with the oldest masked booby, and we've kind of gone back progressively to younger one here. All right, we're gonna have to move on, wrap this up. Again, hooded appearance, clean white below, and the underwing shows some sort of dark white contrast. I wouldn't focus on that. Look for the hood, the white high neck, and the bill color, and that should enable you to tell masked booby. Brown booby is almost, no matter what their age, they almost always show a contrast between a brown head and a white belly. This can be very faint in young birds, but it's usually present. Maybe in the various youngest birds, it's not, but in those, you want to just look at the overall brown chocolate color and look at the color of the bill, which is a sort of straw yellow, very pale yellow. And you'll notice that in proportions, the bill is not quite stout, but not thin and needle-like either. It's sort of in between masked booby and red-footed, which we'll see next. The thing to look for is the dark demarcation between the hood and upper neck, and then the lower breast and belly, dark and white. And that contrast is typical of most plumage morphs, most age classes of the brown booby. We don't have a whole lot of red-footed boobies in the Caribbean, but it's a very interesting species. It's the only tropical pseudolid that is requires bushes or small trees to breed in. They don't usually nest on the ground, and it has the most nocturnal habits. The best thing to look at is the bill color and the face. If you see bubblegum pink and blue together, it is a red-footed booby, no matter what the color phase. And unfortunately, red-footed boobies come in two color phases, both a light and a brown or dark, and that can trip us up because the dark one can trick our minds into, we think we're seeing a brown booby. But look at the bill, it's much thinner than a masked boobies and slightly thinner, less robust than a brown. And that bubblegum pink and blue face, that juxtaposition there, I mean, it's only a red-footed booby. It's also slimmer and much more acrobatic and dynamic in winds when it's at sea. This is a dark face red-footed boobies, you can still see some bubblegum color on the bill and this bluish tone next to it. Again, that juxtaposition tells us that it is a red-footed booby and not a brown booby. The other thing that tells us always is the tail is always white in a red-footed booby. So even here in this dark phase, it's white. So a white tail tells us we have a red-footed booby. As you can see here, I'm going back to brown. You can see that the tail on it is dark or brown. But so if we wanted anything at all, one single thing to tell us that we had red-footed booby, it would be the tail color, the white tail color. Okay, lastly, we're going to end with this that everybody knows, and I'm not going to tell you any bad dad jokes about brown pelicans. The easiest way to tell them is simply their awkward, sort of clumsy looking appearance, although they're very, very good at living in the ocean and feeding and diving on forage fish. The big, long, massive bill with the droopy gular pouch and the sort of chunky appearance should help you distinguish brown pelican from everything else. When it comes to aging one or telling whether or not it's in breeding status, the brighter buffy tones and a bright red around the eye tends to indicate a bird that's in breeding condition. Outside breeding season, that color diminishes and goes more back to a white and brown pattern. And then birds that are a year or so old are mostly just dull gray brown. They don't have any stark contrast with the white neck or head. Lastly, we're going to end here. If you have to get one identification guide, I recommend Peter Harrison's Seabirds, the new identification guide. And again, if you want to increase your identification skills, take those 6 groups of birds that I mentioned and spend time with them, because if you can do those, the rest of it's easy. And thank you for your time.
All right. That's fantastic, Chris. Wow. So many great tips. I'm going to be marking up my field guide with all of your tips. Really, really excellent. We have a couple of questions. Can you comment on if you have a roseate tern and a common tern standing side by side on a rock together, a key, what's the best way to tell them apart?
Well, if they're next to each other, the bill alone should do it. The bill looks slim and long for a bird of that size, and the common tern's bill will look a lot shorter. The other thing is the tail is much longer. So again, if you have them next to each other, that should stick out. If you only have one of them at a time and they're at a big distance, and you're still in the breeding season, I would look for something else. I would look for any kind of contrast between a gray neck, underbelly, a white cheek, and the black skull cap. That's a common tern. If it's pale ghostly white throughout, or if it has a roseate pinkish sheen to it, then it's a roseate tern. So there's several things you can use, but it might be a little not as straightforward separating them at a distance sitting as it would be if they were in flight, because you don't have, you can't see that black, whether or not it has that black V like a common tern or just a black leading edge like the roseate.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that in-flight tip is really helpful. But yeah, if you see one standing by itself, it might be tricky, but I think the tail length is a good one, whether it extends beyond the wings or not. Or
roseate terns are just supremely elegant looking birds. They just, they look, they're put together very well. Yeah. And their proportions are very, 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 very elegant. Where I think a common tern kind of looks like what I would call a generic Sterna tern. Forster's common, Arctic, you know, they all kind of, they're similar enough. They're hard to tell apart in many plumages. Whereas I think a roseate's ghostly appearance and its long, elegant, sort of stretched out silhouette should help you when it's perched.
Okay, Excellent. All right, if anybody has questions, please add them to the chat or the Q&A panel. Chris is willing to stay on for as long as needed to answer everybody's questions about ID.
So Luis Ramos has a good question. Does anyone know if red-footed booby can change from a brown morph to white morph during their life? I don't know the answer to that. I do know that both morphs occur in the same colony. And depending upon where one is in the world, there might be more of one morph than the other. I don't know that they even assortively mate, meaning that browns only mate with browns or the whites only with whites. I think it's like hair color in humans. It can kind of pop up, you know, in various combinations. But they're the same species, and they, in every respect, their ecology and behavior, they're identical. I noticed we have some people here from Mexico. Do they know what the proportions are for dark and white morphs in the few dozen pairs that breed on the Campeche bank?
Yeah, feel free to.
If you
add
don't,
your,
just
in the chat. Okay, and just a reminder to everybody that we are going to be sending a link for a post-webinar poll. Natalia has shared it, so if you can click on it, on the also sending a link for a short poll to learn more about you and your work so that we can follow up with you with the seabird census that we're planning for 2023. All right, and another question from Robert Gundy. Do you have recommendations on techniques for keeping eyes on a moving bird while in a boat? Half the time on pelagic trips, I'm seeing sky waves with only brief moments of birds. Sounds familiar.
yes. Well, it takes a lot of practice, but the first thing is just get your sea legs and feel comfortable taking your eyes away from the horizon at all. And I would never give you any advice that puts safety behind bird identification. Especially depending on the size and the layout of the boat. Small boats especially are really hard to keep an eye on the bird. But in general, if you're in a stable place and you're not at any risk of falling, or worse, falling overboard, the best way generally is to keep your eyes on the bird, and without moving your eyes or your head, put your binoculars up at the same time. And you can practice this on land. It's people beginning birders often have to perfect that seamless transition to looking at something and not moving their eyes or their head, so that when they put the binoculars up, they're still in the general vicinity of the bird itself. With more practice, you'll learn that things like storm petrels or shearwaters or gannets or boobies fly differently. And so you can start to scan using their average flight speed so that you don't lose the bird in that motion. But that takes a lot more practice and familiarity. It's very, very difficult to do. And even when we're on large ships with stable platforms, we lose birds. You know, we see them by the naked eye, and by the time we get on them with binoculars, one or hopefully not both, but usually one of us takes the other person telling us exactly where it is. It's tough. So don't feel like it's just you. I've been doing that for 40 years now, and it's still hard.
Wow. Chris asked if anybody had seen a black noddy in the Caribbean region. Has anybody seen one? Say yes or no in the chat. Good for you, Susan.
Oh. Yeah, so that's what I would have expected, that as far as I can tell, the Netherlands Antilles are the best place to see black knotty. It's rather mysterious. Its comings and goings and its status in the North Atlantic is rather mysterious. There just aren't a lot of places with them, and I think the largest colonies of them are in the tropical Atlantic, like in the islands off Brazil, Fernanda de Noa and maybe Trindade, but it's a very, very scarce bird in the North Atlantic. Yeah, there is one, somebody mentioned, Robert, that shows up at the Dry Tortugas. That's the only place I've ever seen them, and the only bird that I've ever seen was on the coaling dock at the Dry Tortugas.
All right, any more questions for Chris? Chris, that was really outstanding. Would love to have you come down and help us with our seabird surveys in 2023.
All right, I'm scheduled to be on a ship much of that year.
Are you really? Where are you going to go?
Well, we had ship problems this year, so we did not do a set of Atlantic surveys that we needed to do, and then I think we'll be going back to the Gulf of Mexico next year. But that's depending on when you run the surveys, what season I might be free. We're going to do the Atlantic surveys in the winter, so.
Yeah,
which is
these will
not
be
the best
mostly-
time to be out there.
Yeah, we'll be doing breeding season surveys mostly. So
How soon, how early do you start those?
I'll let Yvonne or Rhiannon or one of the other panelists, Natalia, answer that. As early as May, or even some could be year round, but is it?
Yeah, well, depend on species. Some some like the brown pelican will have to start somewhere around the fall. Well, northern hemisphere fall, like end of, well, I guess December, and then going over the year. So that could be either the end of December, if 23, or end of 22. It'll depend on how organized we are and how we can set it up.
Mhm.
But
Yeah.
we're hoping to start. Most of it will start in April, May.
Right.
Jessica asked a question, Lisa. Is there
Yeah.
any way to distinguish male from female lease terns? As far as I know, not in the field, not at a distance and in the field, but I'm going to try to scan through my copy of Harrison here to make sure I give you the correct answer. Doesn't seem like it. It's just between breeding and non-breeding and by age. One of the other things I would say for a lot of Caribbean seabirds, or well, tropical seabirds, is that some species can do this thing called asynchronous nesting in the year. So we know that this happens with mass boobies in, for example, the islands on the Campeche Bank off northern Yucatan. Not all mass boobies nest at the same time. What that means, if you're interested in identification, is that at any given time, you could see mass boobies of varying ages. So you have to know all of them. You can't just know, oh, well, it's this season, so I'm just going to have either young of the year, 1 year birds, or adults. No, you could have 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 4 year, or 5 year birds all at the same time and at the same place. And so that makes it tough. And it makes the seabirds that don't achieve adulthood in one step, like gulls and sulids, it makes their identification much more challenging.
Okay, so Luis Ramos says you can tell behaviorally the male and female lease terns. Maybe you could send a comment about that.
It's probably related to courtship displays, and as I recall, it's been years and years since I've seen this, but I believe the males bring small fish as sort of courtship gestures to the females, so that would help.
Okay.
And and obviously, if you could see this in a colony, you probably could tell males from females. I was thinking of at sea. When you're at sea, you generally can't tell sexes apart for most seabirds. There are exceptions. The bill coloration on breeding female and breeding male brown boobies is different. And so if they're in that bright breeding plumage, you can tell males from females.
Excellent. All right, well, thanks again to everybody who attended, and thank you, Chris, for that outstanding presentation. We will have this available for viewing on our YouTube channel and also on our Facebook page. And we'll look at providing a copy of the PDF, I think, on a restricted basis or copyrighted photo. So perhaps just to the people that attended the webinar. I'm not sure, Chris, what do you think?
Yeah, I just got the best photos I could without having, to write who did it, or unless it was already on there. So I wouldn't want to run afoul. I think if there's a view only mode, if there's a way that people can access the presentation in view only,
Right.
I wouldn't think, and as long as that format says that it was for these educational reasons and purposes, I think we'll be okay.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good. We'll aim to do that. Because I know I'll be reviewing the presentation again before I go out seabirding to refresh my memory on all these great tips. So, all right. Well, thanks again, everybody. We will be emailing you to follow up to ask you that you please fill out the attendee list and the short poll that we have. We want to keep in touch with all of you. Let me just show one last image where, in case you're not familiar with us, you can copy down our contact information. Hold on one second. And for example, sign up for our newsletter, sign up for our listserv. Hopefully you guys can see that. All right, so you can see there a link to sign up for our monthly newsletter from our website. We encourage you to become a member. We also have a listserv on groups.io, which is where a lot of people keep in touch about research that they're doing, conservation issues. It's a great place for sharing information and having discussions. We have announcements there about conferences, training workshops, things like that. And then, of course, follow us on social media to keep up to date. We often post on Seabird Saturday, all about seabirds. So we look forward to keeping in touch with all of you. And thanks again for joining us. And thanks again to Chris. Take care, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Yeah,
Thank you.
you too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, everyone.